for the organizers for the opportunity to give this tutorial talk. I don't know how much of a tutorial it is versus trying to talk about my field of research, essentially, but I'll try and tailor to everyone in the room, since I know this is not parallel track, so hopefully everyone gets something out of it. So for quick introduction, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in the psychology department, and my background is more like cognitive neuroscience, with sort of diving a little bit into computational work during my postdoc, but sort of always more of a data-driven type of approach in terms of like using model to fit data, which is something I'm slightly trying to use the other way around it in my work now a little bit more. But so today I'm going to dive into how we can leverage individual differences in reinforcement learning and decision making, mainly through the lens of computational psychiatry, and that is how individual computations may relate to psychiatric disorders or symptoms. So this focus in general on individual differences, my broader interests mostly come from the pretty intuitive idea that individuals differ from one another in how they learn and make decisions, and especially in sort of our complex social world. So this is an AI-generated image, just disclosure, but I thought it made a pretty good job at actually illustrating the prompt, so I kept it for the intro. And in particular, when I prompted the AI to like, oh, why did you generate this way? And it kind of gave some good answers in terms of like the ways in which people might differ from one another. And in particular, it highlighted kind of this idea that people might differ in how they process information, in how they process or are sensitive to uncertainty. They might differ in the kind of planning strategies they deploy to solve a task. And also in the sort of social connection or social learning mechanisms they deploy. And so this is kind of just a few ways of how heterogeneity or individual differences might manifest themselves cognitively. So in sort of more written form, in order to navigate our world, which is complex, dynamic, also socially connected, it is crucial to be able to deploy multiple learning strategies. But also, it kind of goes without saying that the more strategies and computational mechanisms different individuals might deploy, the more likely people will differ from one another in how they solve tasks. And the current literature kind of lacks a robust characterization of those individual differences, mostly because, for other purposes that are a completely valid approach in terms of gaining insights, the literature in sort of human computational modeling has often focused on a best model fits all approach, right? Trying to compare different models and pick the best one. But a lot of the time, it's likely that, it's very rare that one model will fit every single individual better. And, while again, this group best model fits all type of approach has brought many insights into, group level mechanisms or group level neural signals, allow sort of filtering out the noise. Some of these studies have had sample sizes, for example, too small to really detect individual differences in a robust way. And so we can focus on individual differences in sort of cognitive computational heterogeneity at the level of model parameters. So that can be, if you think of a very simple, Q learning model, sort of separating individuals based on whether they have a high or low learning rate. But with the sort of idea that I brought about not necessarily relying on the best model fits all approach, we can also characterize individual variability by finding which model fits which individual best. So, for example, some individuals might use an RL strategy with a fixed learning rate, and some individuals might be able to vary or use dynamic learning rates, right? Vary their learning rates according to the environment. And so why should we care about this? From the human intelligence perspective, the idea is that by characterizing individual differences, we can better understand those computational mechanisms that underlie human cognition. But also, and what I'll cover mostly during this talk, is provide insights into how differences in these mechanisms might be disrupted in mental health disorders, but also potentially have relevance for other domains than just mental health. Now, from the more artificial intelligence perspective, the experts in the room can interrupt me or disagree with me because I'm not an AI expert at all. But it's my understanding that there are multiple AI models out there, many of them, more and more every day. And so understanding the heterogeneity of AI models can also be relevant. And so kind of understanding how different models perform differently to one another could rely on some of those individual differences approach. And also in the sense of thinking of AI-human interaction, we can use some of these insights to potentially improve AI models' ability to adapt to the variability in the human users. Okay, so the outline of my talk, I will kind of give a little bit of an intro to this field of computational psychiatry, this overarching aims and the methods the field uses. I'll cover a few sort of influential studies also that I'll use kind of a case study type approach because it's, the field is already a bit too broad to characterize it fully, and give a few applications to the more sort of social learning sides from my own work. Okay, so what is computational psychiatry? So it's a somewhat recent field of research which focuses on applying mathematical models and computational framework to describe disruptions in neurocognitive mechanisms in relation to psychiatric symptoms or psychiatric disorders. And the overarching goal, the idea and why we think that field might be important is to move beyond the sort of more subjective symptomatology and complement it, or at least move towards a more objective and quantifiable explanations of the mechanism in mental dysfunction. And so some future application and why we think that might lead to something, though we're probably still a bit far away from it as a field, is to kind of improve either diagnosis accuracy and the methods. So not necessarily to replace clinical interviews, but maybe to complement them with more objective measures of cognitive tasks and cognitive models. And maybe in the long term to contribute to precision psychiatry, right, or precision medicine. So if we're able to characterize someone at the individual level, we can maybe target their individual symptoms and develop more tailored interventions. Okay, so a quick sort of history of the field. If you're interested, I highly recommend reading of these some of these papers, essentially, that were kind of influential in starting the field. So a lot of these are more opinion or review papers or sort of discussions of how existing computational framework might provide insights into understanding mental illness. There was also a book published in 2016. Since 2017, we have our own journal, which is gaining a lot of traction. In 2019, it became its own sort of funding program at the NIH. So sort of, kind of an NIH priority area to fund research. So very lucky to be part of this. And since 2023, there is Computational Psychiatry Conference, which will be happening next month in Tübingen, and I think some of you guys will also be there. So yeah, it's really good to see sort of the emulation and all of the field getting together that way. Okay, so diving a little bit more into the sort of approaches now that the field uses broadly. So I think it can be sort of separated into more theory-driven and data-driven approach and trying to combine those approaches together. So the theory side comes a little bit from, as I mentioned before, using formal models of cognition or of brain behavior relationships. And RLDM model have kind of emerged very early in the field as very popular candidates, given the already existing and theoretical framework from a lot of the dry side of our field. So that was sort of how it got merged in the early stages. From these models, we can derive mechanistic hypotheses about different computational mechanisms and link them to symptoms. And the sort of theory-driven approach will still involve some data in the sense that our models will usually be fitted to human choice data or learning data. So for example, human completing an oral task. And then the data-driven approaches are sort of used more in terms of the symptom characterization or linking those computational model parameters to symptoms. So there's a use of both unsupervised learning and supervised learning methods, whereby unsupervised learning might come more as understanding how the data is organized, essentially. So I'll give a few examples of those in the studies later. So essentially, one approach can involve running factor analysis to characterize symptom dimension and really extract separable symptoms from self-report questionnaires or from clinical interview data, et cetera. And the second approach is kind of similar, but more with this idea of grouping people, right? So forming from an heterogeneous population, forming subgroup of people that might be more homogeneous to one another. So sort of separating either cognitive profiles or symptom profiles with clustering methods. And then the supervised learning approach are a bit more with prediction. So once we have quote unquote ground truth of like, symptoms, can we predict those symptoms from computational parameters or from the cognitive profiles? It can be also used in sort of classifying sort of methods to separate different patient groups and based on someone's cognitive strategies, try to train a classifier to predict which group, like a patient group or a control group, this participant is more likely to be part of. And the same way as a theory-driven approach tend to rely on data, those data-driven approach also will rely on some theory in the sense that those psychiatric symptom constructs we're playing with are not just coming out of the blue, and there is obviously a lot of an entire field of psychiatry that has established meaning behind these symptoms. Okay, so while I'm on the slightly more psychiatric side, and I feel there might be a few psychiatrists in the room, so please interrupt me if I'm saying this wrong, because I'm not a clinician, but I wanted to give people in the room a little bit of an idea of, and an example, which I think to me, this example was kind of very influential towards the end of my PhD of why I kind of wanted to get into that field. And it's this idea of trying to move beyond those sort of broader disorder categories in psychiatry. And so according to the DSM-5, which is the gold standard manual to diagnose psychiatric disorders, we could have two people diagnosed with the same disorders, take depression as an example, but exhibit very few symptoms in common. So just to give a broad overview, the criteria for diagnosing depression is usually involve experiencing for at least 2 weeks. One of those two symptoms appear, so either depressed mood, which is more sort of sadness, being blue, etc., for at least 2 weeks very consistently, or experiencing anhedonia, which is more the loss of interest or loss of pleasure in doing the things that normally interest a patient. And then the other list of symptoms, like a patient would have to meet at least 4 of these to kind of meet criteria. So it could be weight changes, either gaining or losing a substantial amount of weight, sleep disturbances that can also go into insomnia or hypersomnia, like sleeping too much, psychomotor changes, so either feeling restless and very agitated, or the other extreme of being more slow and sort of retardation. Fatigue, loss of energy, guilt or feelings of worthlessness, concentration difficulties, and suicidal thoughts. So, there's about maybe 10 possibilities out there. And so obviously you could come with, say, 2 examples of individuals. So those 2 individual profiles would both meet criteria for major depression, but not, again, necessarily overlap in any of their symptoms. And so the goal behind the field is sort of to better characterize, those processes that are disrupted on depression. Maybe we should focus on the individual symptoms rather than the disorder per se. And so the field, and I mean, maybe the term existed before, but my impression, the field kind of came up with this transdiagnostic term, which is this idea that also a lot of these symptoms may carry relevance across multiple disorders, right? So if you think of insomnia, there's obviously multiple psychiatric disorders where insomnia might manifest itself. And so by providing insight into insomnia, we're not only going to help depressed patients, but also patients with other disorders. And as I mentioned before, by characterizing those associations, we can sort of slightly get into a more individual characterization based on someone's symptom profiles to hopefully in the maybe shorter to longer term future come with interventions. Okay, so I will sort of zoom into a few studies that were influential, at least to me, when getting into these fields, and sort of go into three sort of symptom dimensions relevant to different disorders. And they'll all have to do with sort of reinforcement learning in some ways. So this first study was actually a meta-analysis, but of, I think, 6 different studies that have used the same task in human participants from different clinical groups. And so the task was to essentially, participants were presented with this smiley typeface, and then like a mouth appeared, and people had to decide whether the mouth was short or long. They had very limited time to do it. It was kind of a difficult task. And then there was, in addition to this more perceptual component, this idea that even if they make the correct answer, they might not be rewarded all of the time. So there is sort of a probabilistic reward component, whereby, in one environment, they're rewarded 75% of the time if the long answer is correct. And in the other environment, those contingencies are reversed. And so essentially, I'm not necessarily going to get into details of all the modeling for sake of time, but you can go read the papers if you're interested. They focus on sort of 2 parameters of the Q-learning model. One was the learning rate, and the other one was a reward sensitivity parameter that kind of quantifies the extent to which people maybe under or overweigh the reward compared to their expected value. And what they found was that in relation to anhedonia specifically, so the symptom of like, losing pleasure, losing interest in depression is negatively related to reward sensitivity. So, but it was not related to the learning rate. And, there's a lot of noise, so there is definitely a significant negative correlation there, but you see that it's not perfect, but, it's some amount of variance explained by a single parameter in a model. And what they also showed is that this was specific to anhedonia. So that's kind of where the symptom specificity, becomes important in the sense that they can find a specific association whereby it's specific to anhedonia, but there was no association with more general sort of anxiety traits or general depression, which is more sort of the sadness type of feeling. Okay, so zooming in another study. So this one had to, this is actually just the initial framework. I'll cover the study after, but there was also a lot of early work in this field of computational psychiatry done into sort of understanding delusion in schizophrenia. And a lot of the modeling and framework here have come a little bit more from sort of Bayesian belief updating, which I personally conceptualize as very similar to RL, just the math is a bit different, but the processes involved can be understood under the same length in the sense of like, combining prior belief or expected value with some sort of reward or evidence to update your beliefs. And so this initial sort of more theoretical framework was that people with schizophrenia might have more sort of wider prior beliefs, or what we call the reduced prior precision, which means that in the belief updating process, their updating is going to be more influenced by the evidence relative to their prior. And this might lead to belief updates that are larger and more unconstrained, and kind of allow for more unusual belief or what delusions are to form, just because the beliefs are less constrained. And a task that was kind of developed to test that framework is the sort of well-known BITS task, which actually has been used in a lot of clinical research and clinical population. And so it's this sort of very a task for, as a proxy for inference, where participants are able to sample beads from a jar, and they have to kind of come up with a conclusion of which jar are these beads drawn from. And so they have some information about the structure of the environment. Usually they're being told the proportion of beads in the task, but they don't know which one is the majority, right? So they might know there's like 75-25% distribution, but they don't know if green is the majority color or red is the majority color. And so by sampling beads from the jars, they can sort of reach a conclusion of whether those beads are more likely to be drawn from a red majority urn or jar or from a green majority jar. And there was actually quite a few studies using this task early on in schizophrenia and actually coming up with the conclusion that generally people with schizophrenia, but then people with other disorders also tend to undersample. That means they make a decision sooner, like they sample, they draw fewer beads before making their decision of which jar the beads are coming from. And it kind of came up in this whole initial studies in this field that this deficit might be very unspecific and might actually be more drawn by reduced cognitive ability or reduced IQ in clinical population broadly. And so in this study in 2019, they kind of wanted to really separate the contribution of what might just be, cognitive deficits versus specifically the ability to infer and to kind of draw a conclusion based on evidence. And so they have this task, which is essentially what I just described, but in the computerized task format. Participants draw a bead. They're giving sort of their belief on a continuous scale, and then they can make a decision whether they want to guess it's coming from the blue jar or it's coming from the green jar, or I want to draw another bead. So I want to keep sampling information. I'm not ready to make my decision. They had, for example, presenting the beads to prevent sort of working memory from playing a role, and deficits in working memory could just lead to undersampling information here. And generally, they run this task in a group of patients with schizophrenia and healthy control. But what was also interesting when it came to the computational psychiatry framework I've been talking about is that instead of just looking at differences between the groups, they focus specifically on delusion severity as a symptom dimension to sort of really get at, well, is there a mechanism that's impaired in a way that sort of scales with the severity of the symptoms? And so in their model, I'm not going to go into all of the details, but they had this equation that models the belief updates, so combining the prior belief with the evidence to lead to a posterior belief. And they had two parameters that could help separate the relative weight that participant would put onto their prior. So this omega-1 looks at higher values mean that they integrate sort of further into the past, so that their prior is sort of more constrained. And the evidence weight might mean that there's a higher contribution of evidence to their beliefs. And what they found is that generally there was an association between, between delusion severity and higher information sampling. So that was actually kind of contradictory to those previous studies. But as I mentioned, those previous study, the undersampling was usually driven most likely by more of a cognitive deficits than specifically a symptom severity. So here they found the opposite effect, and especially in those more uncertain jar, there is a clear, the red bars, which are people with higher delusion severity, tend to draw more beads before they make a decision. And this in their model was explained by this higher prior weight of omega-1, which means increased reliance on early information. And so essentially you can think of this a little bit as potentially consistent with this imprecise prior, right? This idea that they need to rely on more information and kind of further integrate from the past evidence in order to reach a conclusion because their prior is more imprecise. Okay, and so moving into the last study, which was also very influential in the way that it sort of also filled other gaps, I guess, in those past work, was to look at goal-directed control and compulsivity or intrusive thoughts. And so we used the two-step task, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, to assess model-based versus model-free contribution to behavior. And is there anyone who would like me to explain the task? Raise your hand. Or is everyone familiar? Oh, no, some people are not. Okay, well, sorry to everyone else, but I'll explain. So in this task, participants make two choices, hence why two-step. So in the first step, they choose between two stimuli here, and they are brought to a second state probabilistically, such that this stimulus, primarily leads to this state, and the right side stimulus here primarily lead to that orange state here. And there is kind of a common transition and rare transition that can bring you to the less common state. And then based on your second choice, second step choice, you get also a probabilistic reward. And the typical common signature of behavior here is this task kind of allows separating whether someone is more likely to be model-free or model-based. Also, we can call it goal-directed in this context. And the main sort of key situation that differ those two types of strategy is essentially if you take this transition here, right? So if you think of a rare transition, imagine you make this choice, you come to this state, you choose this, and you get a reward. If you're purely model-free, you're just going to repeat this past choice, right? And so the next time around, you're going to repeat that choice. And this is what this gray bar here refers to, right? This idea that if you have a rare transition that is rewarded, you're going to be more likely to stay. But if you're model-based and you've learned the structure of the environment here, you're going to switch to the other side, right? Because if you know the stimulus is good and is likely to give you a reward, well, you're going to know that by switching to this purple one here, you're going to be more likely to end in that state and to be able to choose this again. And so this is where this models here. So this low propensity to stay, which means more likely to switch and sort of act according to the goal. And so what the study asks is essentially whether individual differences in the model-basedness or goal-directedness can predict psychiatric symptoms in the general population. And so in my mind, this is where I thought the study was very influential, that it was kind of the first study in the field to kind of leverage conducting studies online and leveraging a really large sample size, which give us, pretty adequate power to look at association in a way, for example, the previous study with 26 schizophrenic patients might, be a bit underpowered. And second, it also was in the general population in the sense that, even in the general population, there are individual differences that are relevant in how we experience mental health symptoms. And even though we might not meet criteria for a disorder, we might still experience symptoms in ways that are relevant for, cognition. And so what the study found across two experiments was a link between the percentage of model-based learning versus model-free and tendency towards sort of OCD symptom. So here it was significant with OCD, no significance with depression or trait anxiety. And in a second study that measured a lot more symptoms, it found sort of this negative association with actually more construct than just OCD. And so the next part comes with additional analysis that was done in the second sample to be a bit more integrated and really separate those sort of transdiagnostic symptom dimension. And so this was sort of data-driven approach that I mentioned at the beginning to sort of perform factor analysis on all of these questionnaires that participant, filled out those self-report about all of these symptoms, and to try to really extract symptom dimensions that are more separable and maybe have more explanatory power. So essentially what this analysis meant, so here each row or column from this diagram is one single question that was asked from participants, and the different colors represent the different questionnaires. And essentially the factor analysis led to kind of those three dimensions that are pretty robust and have been replicated now in a lot of studies, even though they might be specific to the questionnaires that are being used, but at least in this study and many others, it's been quite replicable to find those symptom dimensions. So one has to do more with anxiety and depression. Some clinicians might argue that in the clinic, anxiety and depression present themselves differently, but the reality is that in the population, they're very often super highly correlated. A second factor had more to do with compulsive behavior and intrusive thoughts. And the third factor had to do more with social anxiety or social withdrawal. And then if you look at this graph on the right, this was kind of linking it back to model-based learning and finding that this factor 2 which was the more compulsive behavior intrusive thought, was really the only one, and now it's very separable from the other two that sort of was associated with this deficit in model-based learning. Okay, so just to conclude a little bit on the overview of computational psychiatry, and I haven't been able to present more recent studies, but essentially there's a lot of promises, but also a lot of pitfalls. And so this idea that obviously we can provide better objective characterization and mechanistic understanding of those disruption is a big promise. The symptom-centered approach is great in the sense that we can apply it to the general population as well as clinical groups. I didn't talk about neuroimaging, but obviously it can also be integrated into neuroimaging studies to understand sort of brain level differences and different levels of analysis as well. And this hope of precision psychiatry in the long term to target the computational roots of symptoms to improve treatment. But the pitfalls, essentially, there is an oversimplification risk, right, to try to model maybe complex symptoms and variable symptoms over time with maybe one single parameter. The models, computational models are not always needed, right? And there is some evidence kind of coming out that maybe some very simple cognitive task that don't necessarily need a model, can just have a quick behavioral variable extracted from it, can predict symptoms just as well or much better sometimes than a computational model. There's a few studies that are coming out showing that those computational model parameters tend to have low test-retest reliability. So if you run the same task in the same participant, a couple months apart, you might not always find the same parameters. And, kind of, this doesn't mean it's all bad. It could also mean that, those self-reported symptoms were really validated to be trait-like measures that are stable over time in ways that maybe those computational, approaches are less validated for this, right? And so there could be a way that the field moves towards validating some tasks that are more, developed especially or designed for this. And maybe some other tasks, there's still relevant variability, it's just more state-like, right? So maybe it's helpful for capturing symptoms that might vary over time. So state anxiety, for example, right? You might be anxious today and you won't be anxious tomorrow. So like if you redo this task under different levels of anxiety, you might perform differently. And that's sort of, some of the field is moving in that direction today. Those unsupervised learning approach can be hard to interpret. Obviously, you can run clustering into separate data sets and end up with different clusters. So then it's hard to sort of make inferences from that. And there will still be a translational gap that, even when we're maybe closer to developing intervention, to what extent can we train clinicians to really adopt those tools? Remains an open question. Okay, so I don't have as much time left to maybe talk about my own work, but that's great because I think the overview of the field was needed. So as I mentioned before, some of the work that I've been doing in the past few years have been trying to move beyond this best model fits all approach and also maybe beyond linear associations between parameters and symptoms. First, because as I mentioned, the best model will rarely fits all. And so it's maybe important to consider the possibility that different individuals are best fit by different models. And associations may not always be linear. And so clustering, even though there are some pitfalls that I just mentioned, it may provide at least an alternative ways to characterize some phenotypes. And the second, where my work kind of contributes, is to better integrate social context. So why? Because we rarely learn and make decisions in isolation. Social context can be seen as maybe more ecologically valid way of studying learning and decision making. And psychiatric symptoms are often linked to social deficits. And there is a recent kind of commentary that I encourage you to read if you're interested in this, but essentially kind of highlighting this idea of needing to integrate social context better in computational psychiatry. Okay, is there any clarification question before I move on while I take a sip? No. Okay. So generally in my research, I'm interested in understanding how we make decisions in our sort of complex social world, and mostly because of some of the things I just mentioned, right? So as human beings, it's pretty much impossible for us to survive in the world without interacting with others. We have like amazingly complex social skills that allow us to connect with strangers, make collective decisions, and just more generally, function in society. Even though some of it is maybe debatable these days, but yeah. And so what my research seeks to understand is really the mechanisms by which learning and decision-making takes place in social context, implementation in the brain, which I'm not going to talk about today, but mostly on the side of how individual differences in those processes may be relevant. And so when it comes to learning, as I mentioned earlier, it's crucial for people to deploy multiple learning strategies. And so in this complex social world, they might deploy strategies that are, quote unquote, a bit more social in the sense involving learning from other people. And so observational learning has come in, the field as a very adaptive skills to have for us as a social species, but also, other social animals. In the sense that it allows us to learn from the consequences of actions in the environment without having to experience the potentially negative or threatening outcomes of those actions. And on the other hand, we still, also rely on direct sort of non-social learning, such as, experiential RL essentially, and trial and error learning. And so the questions I'll kind of cover in this part of the talk are two of the studies that I've worked on is using computational methods, can we better characterize the heterogeneity in this sort of balance between different learning strategies? And is this heterogeneity relevant for psychopathology? And so in the first project, we looked at the balance between observational and experiential learning. While in the second project, we focus on this more social observational learning and two strategies that people might deploy during OL. So EL, I will say, for experiential learning, and OL for observational learning. And so for the first project, the quick background in why we decided to start this study in the first place was kind of driven by a larger body of work in my postdoc lab to look at how people arbitrate between different learning strategies, and especially how those arbitration mechanisms might vary depending on the uncertainty in the environment. And so we have this review paper out looking at this mixture of framework in the human brain, and how this idea that control over behavior might be allocated based on the reliability of different experts or different learning strategies, and how those might be represented in the brain. And so there is evidence for this, obviously, in the more model-free versus model-based arbitration literature, but we wanted to expand this in that study by looking at sort of cross-domain arbitration. So whether people are able to dynamically arbitrate between a more experiential versus more social learning strategy. And so we designed a task to look at this. For the sake of time, I might not explain it in a ton of details and focus a little bit more into the modeling and results. But essentially, it's a task that mixes observing the behavior of another participant. And that participant has some knowledge or that partner has some knowledge that me as the participant don't have. And so it's useful for me to infer my partner's goals from observing their behavior. And then I can also do some basic kind of model-free experiential learning by just choosing a token and getting a reward, and sort of learning the continuance in that way. And so we varied a lot of things in the design, and a lot of work went into that. I'm happy to answer more questions after. And that's because we were interested in this dynamic aspect, right? So are people able to adapt their strategy, whether they learn more on EL or OL, depending on which strategy might be more reliable at a given point in time? And those uncertainty manipulation kind of help us get at that. And so we collected 2 data sets online. The first study was more of a pilot, but in the end, our results kind of replicated nicely between the two. So we kept them separate. And we fit 5 different models to the data. So first, we fit sort of individual strategy model, right? So this idea that the OL model means that participant might learn associations between the partner's choice and the partner's outcome, essentially, and then infer value from the observed choices. The EL model is the typical basic sort of Rescola-Wagner learning, looking at prediction errors to update an expected token value. And then there's a fixed arbitration model that combines the prediction of OL and the prediction of EL with a fixed parameter. And our dynamic arbitration model, which initially was maybe our hypothesized best model fits all type of results, but this is not what we got. And where this weight parameter, instead of being fixed, will vary from trial to trial, depending on the reliability difference between OL and EL. And again, I'm not going to go into the math, but essentially, this reliability was calculated as sort of unsigned prediction error. So this idea that when a strategy leads to higher prediction errors, it is less reliable. And then we fit a baseline model, which we found to be really helpful, especially, I think, because this is done online and some participants online are just trying to get through the task and get their payment. And this actually helped us in some ways to not just exclude those participants because they weren't random. So they're still doing something, they're just not learning the task per se, but we thought by keeping this model, it's a way to keep those participants in the sample and sort of look at that heterogeneity a bit better. Yes. Mm-hmm. There is actually, yes, this dynamic arbitration. I guess I didn't put the equation for this, but this is driven by another parameter that modulates the weight on the reliability, right? So the extent to which this parameter is actually sensitive to the variations in reliability. So there is that parameter in there, actually. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So actually, 1, 2, 3 are a reduced version of 4 here. So it is possible that we could just have 4 and look at individual differences. The idea is that if someone only does OL, their EL learning rate, for example, is irrelevant, right? So you can think if this parameter is 1, whatever happened on this side of the equation is irrelevant. And therefore, it's impossible to fit or to interpret necessarily the parameter corresponding to this model because they're not estimated properly in a way, right? And I think there are methods that will maybe could get at this, obviously in model fitting. So I'm not trying to say this is the only approach that works, but that was kind of our thinking behind still trying the simpler version as a standalone model, essentially. But you're right that those are all reduced version of this in some ways. Okay. And so what we did is that we use hierarchical Bayesian inference to fit those 5 models to the data. And we classified people, so this is what we call a clustering method, but actually it's not purely data-driven clustering in the sense that we use directly the model fitting metric, so here those exceedance probability, to assign people to a group that corresponds to their best fitting model, right? So here participant number 1 would be assigned to this fixed arbitration model, participant number 2 to the OL group, etc. And then we were able to see that, first of all, as a sanity check, the groups that resulted from this assignment were fairly different in behavior, in their behavioral signatures, in ways that would have been sort of predicted by the model. So, the dynamic arbitration group learns the best. People who rely on observational learning, which are those 3 curves here, they're able to sort of be above chance from the first trial because they're able to infer something directly from the partner's choice, whereas those baseline or EL only will the baseline model doesn't learn and the EL model takes longer to learn. And those are more some GLM characterization, which I'm not going to get into details, but the idea is just that, again, the groups will differ in expected ways. And then what we were interested in knowing, bringing it back to the computational psychiatry, is whether those 5 groups that come from those 5 best fitting model differ also in psychiatric symptoms. So we have focused only on a kind of reduced set of symptoms here. So mostly focusing on sort of trait state anxiety, depression, and more like social anxiety, social responsiveness, which is a proxy for sort of more autistic traits. So we're not necessarily able to get into things like, schizotypy that we saw could be relevant, or, OCD type symptoms or compulsivity, et cetera. But within that set of questionnaire, we were able to identify 8 different and pretty separable factors. So I'm not going to get into all of these details, but essentially here, because of the questionnaire we use, we're able to separate different dimensions of sort of depression versus anxiety versus more social deficits. And then we just looked at whether those 5 groups that are defined solely from the computational model and reflecting different strategies used in the task differ on those symptom dimensions. And so we run just a very simple, actually, regression model to test this once we have our groups and we have our factor scores. And we also wanted to control for age, gender, and IQ. And here we pulled the results on between the 2 studies because our first study was not very high sample. But essentially, especially controlling for IQ was important because, a lot of those differences could come from IQ in a lot of those cognitive tasks. And what we found is that we did find some significant differences. So I'll break it down in the next slide because this is a very complex plot. But is the idea that, factor scores on average are all 0, right, across the population. But once you break them down by those model-based group, they show different profiles, essentially. So kind of seeing as each group shows a different profiles of symptoms, which we thought was quite interesting. And the only significant difference is actually there weren't that many. It kind of came only between symptoms in this baseline group versus this dynamic arbitration group. And it was mostly based on 2 or maybe 3 symptom dimension, but mostly looking at trait anxiety, which is this very negative one here, and autism or like autistic traits here, which show the opposite pattern in this group. And so if I break it down here by just focusing on these 2 symptom dimensions, what we found is that even though as a continuous measures, those symptoms are, pretty weakly but positively associated in the population, and we know that because, people with autism have much higher rate of anxiety. Once we separate them based on those groups, like model fitting groups, they're very separable, and if anything, they're negatively associated here, right? So we have those separate groups in this 2D symptom profiles now. And so again, as I said, just even though they're positively correlated in the sample, trait anxiety and autistic trait are clearly separable by groups. Okay, so I think I'm almost out of time, so I might skip this conclusion and focus on the next one since I'll break it all, bring it all back at the end. And so in this study, I'll move a little faster because it was essentially a very similar approach that we used, except that here we're focusing only on observational learning and on 2 strategies that people might deploy when they learn from observation, which is more like imitation learning, so copying another person's action, versus emulation, which we define here as more of a goal inference, right? So inferring another person's goals and intention. And specifically, this study was led by a very talented grad student in my postdoc lab, Chen Wu, and she was very interested in specifically looking at a potential deficit in this emulation or social inference process in relation to autistic traits. And so I think I'll skip to the task for the sake of time, but essentially we have a task that allows us to separate those 2 strategies. And we did the same sort of modeling approach, right? Where we have an imitation model, an emulation model, fixed arbitration, dynamic arbitration, where the arbitration weight varies across time, and then a baseline model. So again, similar approach to make it more similar between the studies. But here we kind of varied our clustering methods as a test of what might work better. And this is mainly because Chen noticed that the way I clustered things in the previous study, which was basically assigning each participant to their best fitting model, that might not necessarily be the best way to cluster people. And this is how she illustrated it, which made a lot of sense in the sense that sometimes you might have participants who actually have two models that are pretty much equal in their performance, but just because of estimation error, you're going to end up assigning one person to this model 2 group and one person to this model 1 group, even though really this might be its own group of participants for whom model 1 and model 2 performs very similarly, right? So there might be more sort of fine-grained clustering that we could do. And so she tried a more unsupervised clustering here with k-means, looking at how participant might cluster based on model fitting metrics. So essentially, the basic R squared, so how well the model performed for the baseline model and each strategy, and then having metric that kind of quantify at an individual level, what's the added value of combining the two strategies given rather than having a single strategy, or what's the added value of a reliability-based arbitration versus a fixed arbitration. And so this led to 4 clusters, which this time we replicated everything independently because we wanted to make sure that this sort of data-driven approach could be validated. And essentially what still ended up happening is that we got people that match the individual model, and it's just that the arbitration groups ended up in the same model, right? So people who do, whether they do fixed or dynamic arbitration, tended to just cluster together, which is sort of similar to what we saw in the previous study. Even based on symptoms, those two groups were very similar as well. And so again, participants showed behavioral differences in the different group. That was our sanity check. And here the relevance for psychiatric symptom was mostly focused on autistic trait. And I'll skip this just for the sake of time, but essentially this was the main finding whereby those 4 groups differ significantly in this measure of autistic trait that we extracted from our data. And we had to do a lot of processing because this was collected somewhat during COVID, and people, obviously it was kind of hard to determine whether people answer high on these questions because they have actual symptoms or just because they're not socializing. So we're in a pandemic. So there was some, but luckily, our results again replicated separately, even though this was collected about 2 years later. And we were able to see that the emulation groups specifically tended to have lower values, and this means less symptoms, right? So higher value in the symptoms means more severity of the symptoms. So sort of validating this hypothesis that generally people with high autistic trait might rely more on either this imitation strategy or are less likely to be able to learn this task. Okay, so I think I'll stop here because the rest wasn't as relevant. We also found some separability to just bring it back with the first study, also between those autistic trait and trait anxiety as a metric, whereby actually the propensity to use emulation was increased in anxiety, where it's reduced in the more like autistic trait symptoms. So sort of, again, this dimension here of learning a particular strategy, which is social inference, kind of helps separate 2 symptom dimensions of autistic trait and trait anxiety. Okay, so with this, I'll just conclude and make sure there's some time for question. So we've seen in this study that there's this sort of separability between high autistic trait and anxiety. Here was the fact that autism-like traits are associated with reduced tendency to deploy emulation during observational learning. We found that all of this replicated, which was very reassuring. Talked about that already. So yeah, just summarize for the final conclusion. So yes, using computational methods, we can characterize heterogeneity in strategy used during social learning. We successfully did that. Classified sort of these individuals into groups that show unique behavioral signatures that are related to their strategy use. And again, the sort of highlighting the advantage of this approach compared to a best model fits all type of approach. We find that this heterogeneity is relevant for psychopathology, even though we didn't really have many pre-existing hypotheses here, except for the autistic trait in the second project. We did end up converging into this sort of separability and this dissociation between autistic trait and anxiety based on those different sort of learning strategy groups, which we want to explore more in the future. Some methodological consideration that obviously, there is a need for really validating the clustering methods. There's a lot of analytical flexibility that goes into this whole pipeline from model fitting to clustering to running regressions, all of these. So it's kind of essential to replicate or at least cross-validate the findings. And current work, because you could argue that some of these studies I just presented may not be very social. So we're trying in my lab to sort of move into some sort of more socially relevant processes. So we're doing a similar study with a big battery of tasks where we're looking at trust learning as a process. We're looking at risk and ambiguity decision-making in social contexts and how people might be influenced by others. I have a student working on sort of social anxiety more specifically and how symptoms might be related to decisions to seek feedback about your own performance from other people. Another of my grad student is doing great work analyzing this really large 10,000 participants worth of data in adolescents, looking at value-based and social decision-making. My other student, Sean, who's here, has a poster on Thursday, so go check it out. He doesn't really do social learning, but his work's super interesting on sort of attention, different sort of attention-controlled decision-making tasks and reinforcement learning and how those might relate to impulsivity as a symptom construct. And also wanted to highlight that this can be applied outside of psychiatry per se. We have a preprint out led by Lisa Clun, who was a postdoc in John O'Doherty's lab with me, and looking at sort of the relevance of this kind of computational psychiatry approach, but applied to conspiratorial thinking as an individual difference measure rather than a psychiatric symptom. So sort of extending it beyond psychiatry. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to contributors and to my lab.